Eleanor, a woman for whom success was a meticulously curated tapestry of ambition and achievement, felt the very threads of her identity unraveling with each piercing shriek from the tiny, red-faced being in her arms. Clad in a crisp cashmere coat and a pair of designer heels that had once signified her command of the city, she was now a monument to maternal failure, trapped in the unforgiving crucible of the rush-hour subway car. Baby Chloe, her infant daughter, was a relentless siren, her cries not just a sound but a physical force that battered against the glass and the fragile composure Eleanor had built over a lifetime. Each high-pitched wail was a spotlight, illuminating Eleanor's inadequacy and attracting a chorus of silent, judgmental stares from 100 weary faces. The lawyer with his folded newspaper shot a glare that sliced through the air. The young couple, wrapped in their own bubble of quiet conversation, flinched and whispered. The elderly woman, clutching her floral purse, tisked with a disapproving shake of her head. In their eyes, Eleanor saw not sympathy but an unspoken verdict. She had failed to control the one thing she should have been able to. She jiggled Chloe, a desperate, frantic motion. She offered a half-hearted pacifier. She shushed, her voice a thin, panicked whisper. Nothing worked. The more she tried, the more Chloe's cries escalated. The sound a feedback loop of shared misery. Eleanor's face, usually a mask of professional confidence, was now a portrait of raw, tear-streaked defeat. Her mind raced, a torrent of self-recrimination. I can handle multi-million-dollar deals, but I can't comfort my own child. I am a fraud. I am not cut out for this. The city, which she had so effortlessly conquered, now felt like a prison. Each rattling turn of the subway car a further descent into isolation and shame. She felt a profound sense of helplessness, a stark realization that all her achievements, her wealth, her status, none of it could buy her a moment of peace, a whisper of understanding. This packed metal box was not just a means of transport. It was a microcosm of her deepest fears, a public stage for her private torment. Across the aisle, nestled in a worn corduroy jacket and holding the hand of his small daughter, sat Marcus. A single father and a struggling musician, his life was a daily negotiation with budgets, bus schedules, and the quiet dignity of making do. His daughter Maya, a child with eyes that held the wisdom of observation, watched the scene unfold with an innocent, unblinking curiosity. She saw not a high-powered businesswoman but a mother in pain. She saw not an unruly child but a baby in distress. Without a word, Maya's small hand slipped from her father's and nudged his arm. Marcus, his mind half lost in a melody he was composing in his head, was drawn back to the present. He followed Maya's gaze, his eyes settling on Eleanor's trembling form and the convulsing cries of her baby. He didn't see an affluent woman. He saw a parent at the end of her rope, a feeling he knew intimately. The moments of quiet desperation, the nights when Maya's fevered cries had felt like the loneliest sound on earth. He remembered them all. With a slow, deliberate movement that belied the train's furious rattle, Marcus stood up. The other passengers shifted, bracing themselves for another outburst, perhaps from a well-meaning but ill-advised attempt at intervention. But Marcus did not approach. He simply stood in the narrow space between the rows of seats, his shoulders slightly hunched as if protecting the moment, and began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound, a melody without words, a tune he had sung 1,000 times to Maya in a quiet room, a simple lullaby spun from the fabric of pure, unadorned love. His voice, gentle and unassuming, was a counternote to the city's harsh symphony. It cut through the metallic screech of the wheels, the muffled chatter of the crowd, the suffocating silence of judgment. The effect was not immediate, but it was profound. Chloe's screams, a tempest just moments before, began to falter. Her cries hiccuped, a tiny intake of air as her small head turned, her eyes wide and still tear-filled, searching for the source of the sound. She found Marcus's kind, compassionate face and, as if by some ancient, forgotten magic, her cries softened. They became whimpers, then soft sighs, until finally they ceased altogether. The silence that descended upon the subway car was more deafening than any noise. It was a stunned collective hush. Eleanor, who had been bracing herself for the next wave of wails, felt her entire body go slack with shock and relief. She looked at Marcus, this complete stranger whose humble jacket and worn shoes spoke of a life far removed from her own, and saw in his gaze not pity, but profound empathy. A single tear, born of a mixture of gratitude and emotional exhaustion, slid down her cheek. He hadn't offered advice. He hadn't demanded silence. He had simply offered solace. His act was a quiet, unassuming miracle, a gesture that transcended class, status, and the harsh boundaries of a bustling city. The passengers, who had been so quick to judge, now looked away, their own faces softened by the sudden, overwhelming beauty of the moment. In that shared space, a simple lullaby had erased the lines of division, proving that the most profound forms of connection often arise from the most unexpected sources. As the train pulled into her stop, Eleanor could only nod, a silent, heartfelt thank you that spoke volumes. She stepped onto the platform. The weight of her helplessness lifted, a new, indelible understanding etched into her heart. Her perception of the world had forever changed. She had learned that a kind heart, a gentle voice, and a simple song could offer a far greater form of wealth than any she had ever pursued. Marcus, the man who had nothing but a hum and an open heart, had given her everything. He had shown her that the true measure of a person's worth is not in the size of their portfolio, but in their capacity for a quiet, human grace. The simple, heartfelt gesture had bridged a chasm of social judgment and had illuminated the universal, desperate need for kindness that exists beneath the surface of every human being, a truth she would carry with her far beyond the confines of the subway and into the rest of her life. The stifling air of the subway car felt thick with judgment, each disapproving glance a physical weight on Victoria's designer-clad shoulders. Her infant son, James, a tiny tempest of red-faced wails, seemed to amplify the silence of the other passengers with his every shriek. This wasn't her world. Her life was one of hushed elegance, of private cars and personal space, a life utterly unprepared for the raw, visceral chaos of a public transit meltdown. She clutched James tighter, a futile gesture against the wave of maternal incompetence that threatened to drown her. The designer diaper bag, a symbol of her supposed preparedness, sat uselessly at her feet. She had all the right things, the organic snacks, the latest noise-canceling headphones, the perfect swaddling blanket, but none of it mattered. All she had was a screaming baby and a profound, aching loneliness in a car full of strangers. A few seats away, Daniel watched, a quiet observer of the unfolding drama. His own world was one of frayed edges and careful budgeting, a constant dance between two jobs to keep his small family afloat. His daughter, Lily, a girl with eyes far older than her years, held a well-loved teddy bear, its fur matted and worn thin from countless nights of comfort. The bear, Mr. Snuggles, wasn't just a toy. He was a silent companion, a keeper of secrets and a source of unwavering comfort. Lily's small hand reached up and offered the bear to her father, her gaze fixed on the distressed mother and baby. Daniel understood without a word. He took Mr. Snuggles, the familiar worn fabric a comfort in his own hand, and with a hesitant but genuine smile, he began to move through the crowded car. He wasn't a hero, just a father who knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed. Victoria saw him coming, a man whose clothes were practical, not fashionable. She braced herself for another glare, another silent condemnation of her failure, but Daniel didn't look at her with scorn. He looked at her with a quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the impossible challenge of parenthood. He didn't speak. He simply held the worn-out teddy bear near James's face. The scent of well-loved fabric, the slightly lumpy feel of the stuffing, and the simple, unconditional comfort of the bear's presence worked a small miracle. James's wails faltered, then quieted, his tiny hand reaching out, his fingers closing around the bear's ear. In that single, breathtaking moment, the air in the subway car seemed to shift. The weight of Victoria's shame lifted, replaced by profound and humbling gratitude. Daniel, a man who had so little in terms of material wealth, had given her something priceless. A moment of peace, a reminder that kindness isn't an accessory, but an innate human connection. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a struggling stranger but a fellow parent, a kind soul who had offered the most valuable thing he had, the simple, pure comfort of a worn-out teddy bear. The world of designer labels and luxury cars faded away, replaced by the warmth of a shared humanity, and the quiet truth that the greatest wealth of all is compassion. The train car was a crucible of controlled chaos, but for Sophia, it felt like her perfectly curated world was melting away. She was an architect of order, a woman who had built her career on anticipating every variable, on having a solution for every problem before it even materialized. Her life was a meticulously designed blueprint, and baby Noah, was supposed to be the crowning centerpiece. Yet here he was, an unforeseen defect in her flawless plan, his cries echoing her own spiraling sense of failure. They were the guttural, piercing wails of a baby overstimulated and overwhelmed, a sound that cut through the mundane clatter of the subway like a knife. Sophia's designer diaper bag, a testament to her preparedness, lay open like a defeated treasure chest. She had offered him the organic, sustainably sourced teether, the crinkle book with its high-contrast images recommended by a child development expert, and the plush musical toy that was supposed to soothe with its gentle lullaby. None of it worked. Each failed attempt, each toy tossed aside by a flailing hand, was another hammer blow to her carefully constructed self-image. The heat in the crowded car seemed to intensify with every cry, and she could feel the phantom gaze of strangers, their silent judgment a palpable weight. They saw her, the woman with the expensive stroller and the pristine clothes, and they saw a mother who couldn't even quiet her own child. The disconnect between her outward perfection and her internal panic was vast and terrifying. Across the aisle, in a world that felt entirely separate, sat Ben. His was a life of recent unraveling. The notice had been clean, efficient, and utterly devastating. Restructuring. The well-worn backpack at his feet held not designer baby gear, but a half-eaten sandwich and a crumpled drawing from his son Sammy. Being a single dad had always been a tightrope walk, but the recent layoff had turned it into a high-wire act with no safety net. He was navigating a sea of uncertainty, but right now, his focus was on a much smaller, more immediate challenge: entertaining his boisterous 6-year-old. Sammy was a whirlwind of perpetual motion, a force of nature that demanded constant engagement. Ben was in the middle of a grand, improvised story, using his hands to conjure castles and dragons, when Sammy's attention, always a fragile thing, was captured by the sound of Noah's distress. The boy's eyes, full of the unburdened curiosity of childhood, were fixed on Sophia and her screaming baby. Ben followed his son's gaze and felt a familiar, empathetic pang. He knew that sound intimately, the sound of a small person in crisis, a parent's growing helplessness. He had lived through it on countless sleepless nights in doctors' offices and on far too many bus rides. He saw Sophia's polished veneer begin to crack, saw the desperation in her eyes as she fumbled with another useless toy. Without a second thought, acting on a parental instinct born of necessity, Ben reached into the worn pocket of his jeans. His fingers closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled out a small keychain, but not one for car keys or a house. This was a collection of forgotten hardware: an old bike lock key, a brightly colored plastic novelty key, and a small, tarnished luggage key, all bound together by a simple metal ring. They were not designer toys. They were the detritus of a busy life, repurposed into a cheap and effective distraction. As the high-pitched wails of Noah's crying reached a crescendo, Ben gave the keys a gentle, rhythmic shake. The sound was soft and jingling, a melodic chime that cut through the noise of the subway and the baby's cries alike. It was a simple, non-threatening sound, and it was utterly unexpected. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Noah's cries faltered, then stopped. His tiny, tear-streaked face turned toward the sound. His eyes, still wet with tears, widened in pure, unadulterated curiosity. He watched the jingling keys with a focus he hadn't given any of Sophia's expensive gadgets. The silence that followed was a gift, a breath of air in a suffocating moment. Sophia looked up, her expression a mix of exhaustion and stunned disbelief. She saw not a perfect stranger, but a man with a tired smile and a simple solution in his hand. Ben didn't say a word. He just offered a knowing, gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity. In that moment, the gulf between their worlds, the world of carefully planned perfection and the world of scraped-together survival, disappeared. The peace that Ben's humble keys had brought was more valuable than any expensive toy, a testament to the fact that the most effective solutions often come not from wealth or status, but from the hard-won wisdom of experience. It was an unexpected connection forged in a moment of vulnerability, a quiet understanding that transcended their different lives and found common ground in the universal struggle and triumphs of parenthood. The subway car was a suffocating box of judgment for Jessica. Her impeccably tailored coat and designer baby carrier felt like a uniform of failure. Her baby, Emily, was screaming with a ferocity that seemed to mock the perfect life Jessica had so carefully cultivated. The wails were a symphony of her own inadequacy, each high-pitched shriek a public declaration that she, the woman with everything, couldn't handle the most basic task of motherhood. She was fumbling through her designer diaper bag, its interior, a chaotic jumble of expensive, useless things, a sterling silver rattle, a cashmere blanket, a miniature organic teether, none of which could quell the rising tide of her baby's distress. She could feel the weight of every disapproving glance, the silent accusations of an audience of strangers. Across the aisle, Tom watched the scene unfold with a quiet, weary empathy. He was a man accustomed to making a little go a long way. A single father navigating a world where every dollar was accounted for. His jeans were faded, his jacket worn at the elbows, and the backpack at his feet held the day's frugal necessities. Beside him, his daughter Chloe sat quietly, her small hand clasped in his. Chloe was a seasoned veteran of public transportation and a natural observer of human behavior. She had seen her dad face countless moments of quiet desperation and had learned the value of a simple gesture. As Emily's cries reached a fever pitch, Chloe looked from the flustered, well-dressed woman to the red-faced baby and then nudged her dad. She pointed with a small finger to her own small cloth bag. Tom followed her gaze and understood immediately. The bag held a secret weapon, a single, small package of fruit snacks. They were a cheap treat, a reward for good behavior, and a lifeline in moments of boredom or distress. He saw the frantic, privileged panic in Jessica's eyes and knew it was no different from the raw, exhausted panic he felt every time he looked at his dwindling bank account. This was not about money or status. It was about the universal, gut-wrenching struggle of a parent in distress. He reached into the bag, pulled out a single, colorful fruit snack, its soft, gummy texture a stark contrast to the hard, unyielding baby toys Jessica had been offering. Without a word, he gently leaned forward and offered it to her. "Sometimes, they just need a little something to chew on," he said, his voice low and kind. Jessica hesitated for a moment, a flicker of pride warring with her desperate need for a solution. But the simple, genuine compassion in his eyes was disarming. She took the fruit snack and offered it to Emily. The baby's cries stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft, contented sound of a baby's gums working on the sweet new texture. Emily's tiny hands reached for the snack, her tear-streaked face now one of pure focus and joy. The tension in the car dissipated instantly, replaced by the quiet hum of the subway and the soft gurgles of a satisfied baby. Jessica looked at Tom, a man she would have once dismissed and saw not a stranger from a different world, but a fellow parent who had offered her the most valuable gift of all, a moment of peace and a reminder that true help is not about what you have, but about the willingness to give what you can. The subway car hummed with a rhythm of its own, a lullaby of motion that did nothing to soothe Michelle's fraying nerves. She was a woman who had always excelled at appearances. Her life, from the curated social media feed to her flawlessly decorated home, was a testament to her ability to control a narrative. But here, on this crowded train, her narrative was unraveling in a cacophony of sound. Her twin babies, Baby A and Baby B, had synchronized their cries into an unbearable high-pitched chorus. One baby's wail would ignite the others, creating a feedback loop of pure, unadulterated distress. Michelle, a millionaire by inheritance but now poor in spirit, felt the crushing weight of expectation. Everyone on the train seemed to be watching her, their disapproving gazes cutting her to ribbons. They saw a woman with a double stroller and expensive clothes, and they saw a failure. The feeling of despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, and she felt tears of exhaustion sting her eyes. Across the aisle, in a world where appearances were far less important than heart, sat Chris. His life was built on a foundation of joy, albeit a simple and often precarious one. He was a single father who made his living as a part-time children's entertainer, and his daughter Sophie was his most enthusiastic audience. Today, their journey was just a simple trip, and Sophie was quietly immersed in a world of her own, a world populated by a worn-out hand puppet. The puppet was a charmingly absurd creature, a fluffy, colorful monster with googly eyes and a goofy grin, a testament to countless puppet shows and impromptu games. Sophie, with the clear-eyed wisdom of a child, looked up from her puppet and saw the two crying babies. She saw the desperation on Michelle's face. Without a word, she nudged her dad and pointed to the struggling family across from them. Chris saw the scene and felt an instant, familiar wave of empathy. He knew the feeling of being overwhelmed, of feeling like you were failing. Jessica sat in the crowded subway, her shoulders tense, her perfectly pressed blouse now feeling like a cage as the shrill cries of her baby, Emily, echoed through the car. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some casting sympathetic glances, others openly irritated, all of them making her feel like an outsider in a world that she, for all her wealth and privilege, should have no trouble fitting into. It wasn't that she wasn't used to being the center of attention. She had spent most of her life being admired, sometimes envied. But this kind of attention was different. This was the kind of attention that made her feel inadequate, as though her ability to meet the demands of motherhood was being questioned by a room full of strangers. It was a small, sickening weight that pressed down on her chest, tightening with every passing moment. She had tried everything to soothe Emily. She rocked her gently in the stroller, whispered soft words that no one could hear, but Emily's wails only grew louder. Desperation clawed at Jessica's throat, and she dug through her designer bag, rifling through the expensive bottles of lotion and lip balm, the perfectly folded baby clothes, searching for something, anything that might help. Her fingers brushed against a pacifier, but Emily, in her current state, wanted nothing to do with it. Her cries filled the space, and Jessica's face flushed with humiliation. She wished she could melt into the fabric of her surroundings, disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. She glanced around, hoping for a sympathetic face, but all she saw were expressions of frustration, impatience, some even rolling their eyes as though she were an inconvenience. The subway car rocked as it passed over the tracks, the noise and movement only adding to the overwhelming sensation of failure that gripped Jessica's heart. She looked down at Emily, her tiny hands flailing, her face contorted with distress, and in that moment, Jessica felt as if she were the only mother in the world who couldn't figure out how to calm her child. Across from her sat Tom, a man who on first glance seemed to be a world away from her. He was wearing a faded jacket, the kind you wear when you don't have the luxury of a closet full of new clothes. His hair was messy, and the lines around his eyes told stories of long, sleepless nights. He wasn't striking or polished, not like the men Jessica was used to seeing in her social circles. But there was something about him that was different. Next to him sat his daughter, Chloe, a quiet little girl with big brown eyes looking up at her father with a mixture of affection and curiosity. She noticed Emily's cries and, without saying a word, nudged her father gently. Tom looked down at her and followed her gaze across the aisle, his eyes landing on Jessica and her distressed baby. Chloe, ever the thoughtful child, held up her small bag of fruit snacks, brightly colored, soft, and squishy. She pointed at them with a quiet insistence, clearly suggesting that they might be just what Emily needed. Tom, understanding that sometimes a simple solution is the best one, smiled warmly at his daughter before looking back at Jessica. "Sometimes they just need a little something to chew on," he said, his voice soft but filled with a kind of knowing warmth. Jessica, taken aback by the gesture, hesitated at first. She wasn't sure why she was so reluctant. Was it pride? The embarrassment of accepting help from someone who didn't fit the mold of what she thought of as capable? But Emily's cries were so much louder now, each wail more painful than the last, and she realized that it was no longer about who was offering help. It was about what Emily needed. With a quiet nod, Jessica accepted the fruit snack, unsure of what to expect. As soon as Emily's small fingers grasped the soft, dissolving treat, her crying began to subside. The relief was immediate. The tension that had built up inside Jessica over the last several minutes, over the last several months, seemed to lift for just a moment as Emily's face relaxed into a soft, contented expression. She chewed slowly, almost reverently, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the subway car was quiet. Jessica's heart slowed, her breathing steadied, and she glanced over at Tom, a man she would have never thought to speak to before. In that fleeting moment, a realization settled over her, quiet and profound. The weight she had been carrying, the sense of inadequacy, the fear of judgment, none of it had anything to do with how she looked or what she owned. It had to do with her ability to show up, to connect with her child, and in this case to accept the help that came from a source she hadn't expected. The truth was that wealth and status hadn't equipped her to handle every challenge. She had always relied on her privileges to make life easier, to avoid discomfort, but in motherhood, discomfort was inevitable. Tom, despite his own struggles, his own tight budget, his own challenges, had something that Jessica didn't have: the ability to see the simple truths. He wasn't offering her grand solutions, but the small practical ones that could make all the difference. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now, the initial hesitation gone. "I really needed that." Tom nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a smile that was genuine but not showy. "No problem," he said, returning to his daughter. Chloe, still watching Emily, gave a small approving nod as if to say, "See, I told you." Jessica laughed softly, feeling a bit foolish but also grateful in a way she hadn't expected. As the train continued its journey through the tunnels, Jessica allowed herself to relax, to breathe, to be present. She looked at Tom again, really looked at him this time, and saw a man who wasn't interested in competing, in proving anything. He was simply there doing the best he could, just like her. Their worlds, so different in many ways, had collided in this small moment, and in that collision, Jessica found a kind of relief that went beyond the fruit snack. She had learned something valuable in the brief exchange. Compassion, true compassion, didn't come from wealth or status. It came from the heart. It came from understanding what someone else needed and meeting them there, regardless of who they were or where they came from. And in that moment, Jessica realized that perhaps the greatest gift she could give to herself and to Emily wasn't in the latest baby gear or designer clothes. It was in embracing the simple, human connections that truly made life richer. The subway ride continued, and as Emily settled against her chest, no longer crying but sleeping soundly, Jessica let her gaze fall on Tom and Chloe once more. She nodded to him, a silent thank you passing between them, and this time it wasn't just for the fruit snack. It was for the reminder that in a world full of judgments and expectations, sometimes the best thing you could do was offer a small gesture of kindness and be willing to accept it in return. Michelle sat on the subway, her head spinning in a whirlwind of exhaustion and self-doubt, the weight of new motherhood pressing on her shoulders like an immovable burden. She had always prided herself on having everything under control, having come from a life of privilege where the pressures of work and life were manageable with the right resources. But nothing could have prepared her for the relentless demands of twin babies. Baby A and Baby B, both only a few months old, were in the midst of a meltdown. Their cries, sharp and unrelenting, filled the small space of the subway car. The high-pitched wails of both infants, a sound that seemed to reverberate through every part of Michelle's being. Her body was on the verge of collapse, her arms heavy with the effort of juggling them both, and yet she felt completely powerless to stop the noise. Her designer bag, stuffed with an assortment of items meant to calm them, pacifiers, toys, even bottles of milk, was of no use. The more she tried to comfort them, the more they cried. She could feel the stares of the other passengers weighing down on her, a mixture of judgment and annoyance radiating from every direction. She could hear their thoughts loud in her mind. Why can't she control them? Why isn't she doing something? Michelle's face flushed with embarrassment as her hands trembled. Her once pristine appearance now disheveled, her makeup smudged from the long hours of trying to keep up with the impossible demands of motherhood. She had always prided herself on being able to manage anything, to solve problems with the right resources and a sharp mind. But this was different. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with money or status. This was the raw, unrelenting challenge of being a mother. And for a fleeting moment, Michelle wondered if she was failing. In her desperation, she felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back, unwilling to let her vulnerability show. She had never been one to break down in front of others. She had always been the strong one, the one who held it all together. But now in this small confining space, she felt utterly, hopelessly lost. Across from her, sitting with his daughter Sophie, was Chris. At first glance, he was the picture of calm in the midst of Michelle's chaos. He was dressed simply, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans, his unshaven face showing the subtle signs of a man who had more important things on his mind than his appearance. He was a single father, a children's entertainer by trade, and he had seen his fair share of difficult moments. Sophie, his daughter, was sitting next to him on the bench playing with a hand puppet. It was a colorful, slightly worn-out monster puppet, the kind that had clearly been loved and used for years. Chris had a way about him, a quiet confidence that came not from wealth or status, but from his deep understanding of people, especially children. Sophie, noticing the distress in Michelle's eyes and the agony in her baby's cries, nudged her father. Her small, gentle gesture spoke volumes. Chris, understanding immediately, gave a soft smile and gently slipped the hand puppet onto his hand. He knew exactly what Sophie was asking him to do. He began to animate the puppet, making it dance and wiggle, his voice transforming into a high-pitched, playful tone. The puppet, with its fuzzy blue fur and exaggerated googly eyes, was silly, its mouth moving up and down in a way that made it seem alive. He made it talk, its voice squeaky and joyful, uttering nonsense words in a rhythm that could only be described as playful chaos. The puppet made silly faces and cooing sounds, its movements exaggerated, almost cartoonish. Sophie, watching intently, giggled softly. But what happened next was nothing short of magical. As the puppet continued its antics, Michelle saw something shift in her twins. Baby A, whose cries had been loud and frantic, stopped for a moment, her little eyes widening as she stared at the puppet. Baby B, who had been kicking her legs wildly, suddenly grew still, her mouth curving into a small, curious smile. The cries that had once filled the air were now replaced with soft gurgles, the baby's attention fixed on the colorful puppet in front of them. Their hands, which had been flailing in frustration, now reached out toward it as if asking for more. Michelle, momentarily stunned, watched as the babies, who had seemed inconsolable just moments before, now sat in silence, their faces relaxed, their little hands reaching for the puppet as if they were entranced. The sound of their cries had been replaced by something new. Giggling. Small baby giggles that filled Michelle's heart with an overwhelming wave of relief. For the first time in hours, she could breathe. The tension in her chest eased. The pressure that had felt suffocating now lifted. She looked at Chris, her eyes wide with gratitude. And for the first time that day, a smile broke through her exhaustion. She had been so caught up in trying to solve everything with reason and logic, with money and planning, that she had forgotten the simplest solution of all. Joy. Pure, unadulterated joy, the kind that doesn't come from expensive toys or fancy gadgets, but from the power of imagination, play, and connection. Chris, with his quiet wisdom, had reminded her of that. As the puppet continued to entertain the twins, Sophie sat back and smiled, her eyes full of pride. She knew her dad had a gift, and she knew that in moments like this it wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about connecting. About bringing laughter and lightness into a situation that could have easily spiraled into frustration. Michelle, who had been so caught up in the expectations of motherhood, who had felt the pressure of trying to be everything for everyone, suddenly realized how much of parenting was about embracing the moments that didn't go according to plan. It wasn't about having all the answers or solving every problem. Sometimes the best solutions were the simplest ones. Sometimes, all you needed was a puppet, a little imagination, and the willingness to laugh at life's absurdities. Michelle looked at Chris again, her heart full of appreciation. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying a weight of emotion she hadn't expected. "You've given me the greatest gift today." Chris smiled back at her, a warm and genuine smile that was full of understanding. "It's nothing," he replied with a shrug. "Just a little magic." Michelle couldn't help but laugh, a light, relieved sound that filled the subway car. In that moment, she understood what he meant. Magic wasn't in grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was in the small moments of connection, in the simple joy of making someone smile, of turning a moment of chaos into one of light-hearted play. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Michelle felt like she could breathe again, like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, not through wealth or status, but through the kindness and creativity of a man and his daughter who had found the magic in the mundane. As the subway pulled into the next station, Michelle felt lighter, ready to face the challenges of motherhood again, with a renewed sense of perspective. She looked down at her twins. Their tiny faces lit up with joy and realized that sometimes the best solution to life's toughest problems wasn't a complicated answer. It was a simple, playful gesture, a reminder that even in the most trying moments, joy could still find a way.